Voting period is now over. Thank you all for voting, and we'll now welcome Tamilore for the start of this evening. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to everyone who is with us online and everyone who is with us in the room here at the Union Chamber. Thank you so much for joining us for the 2024 Annual WHT Scholars Debate. I am Tamilore Oni, studying the Master of Public Policy at the Blavatnik School of Government, also at Kibu College, and I will be your host for today. The Weidenfeld-Hoffmann Scholarships and Leadership Program is a global scholarship that cultivates the leaders of tomorrow. It provides outstanding university graduates and professionals from developing and emerging economies with the opportunity to pursue fully funded graduate studies at Oxford. It offers a comprehensive program of leadership development, long-term mentoring, and networking. Since 2008, it has supported more than 400 scholars from across 94 countries. The annual Scholars Debate, which is why we're here today, is organized and led by the scholars and is part of the WHT Leadership Program. Today's debate will be on the motion, "This House believes that individuals should bear responsibility for the actions of their government." The debate will follow an alternating format where we'll have a representative from the proposing team, followed by a representative from the opposing team, and they will alternate until all four speakers from each team has presented. And each speaker will have 4 minutes to present their arguments. After that, we will open the floor for questions from the audience, from you in the room and also online. So please take note of your questions as the speakers speak. For those online, feel free to keep your questions coming in. We'll be taking note of them. And for those in the room, we'll take them live after the debaters have concluded their arguments. You can also address your questions to a specific team, either the proposing team or the opposing team, or you can direct it to a specific team member if you have like a specific point that you'd like to clarify. Please note that the views expressed here are not necessarily those of the debaters or the organization. Joining us today is our esteemed chair. We have with us Professor Rhett Larson, who is the Richard Morrison Professor of Water Law at the Arizona State University. He's also a senior research fellow with the Kyle Center for Water Policy at ASU, the Morrison Institute for Public Policy. He was also a WHT scholar in 2010 and 2011, and he studied the Water Science Policy and Management program here at the university as well. Join us as we welcome our chair to begin the debate. Thank you.
It is a pleasure to be here with all of you and an honor to be able to be a part of this outstanding event. I know as an alum of this program, I remember how it felt to be in these chairs and how nervous my new friends are, but I look forward to a spirited and enlightening debate. For our audience, the members, our debate teams come from around the world. They include scholars from India, Nepal, Pakistan, the Philippines, Russia, South Korea, Syria, and Ukraine. And this should be a wonderful conversation. One of the first questions, according to the book of Genesis, that humans asked of their creator was, "Am I my brother's keeper?" And this conversation has been expanded over the centuries, over the millennia. Thomas Scanlon asked in his seminal work, "What do we owe each other? If we each have a collective obligation, if we create states for the protection of individual rights to see that those mutual obligations are met, then what is the inverse of that obligation? What does the individual then owe to the collective, and how do they take responsibility for the collective?" is going to be the challenge of this conversation. As an attorney, I know the difficulties of delineating this problem. We know that a getaway driver and a bank robbery is obviously part of a broader criminal conspiracy, but are the parents of the bank robber or the manufacturer of the getaway car? Those are the sort of difficult questions that strike to the heart of what we're doing, but in the much broader sense in dealing with the power of the collective as a state. Before we begin, I will read the pre-votes. The total number of voters is 66. The number of ayes for the proposition is 19, and the number of nays is 47. So the winner, at least in the pre-vote, is the opposition. We will begin with our first speaker for the proposition, Taha Qadri from Pakistan, who is reading for an MSc in Economics for Development at Worcester College.
Thank you, Rhett. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Today, in the guise of popular will and the greater good of the nation, governments oppress individuals both internally and abroad. And reflecting upon ourselves, most of us deny any responsibility by saying that we didn't vote for such a government or that we can't even do anything. So hence, we are not responsible for anything which the government does. But today, we are here to challenge this culture of indifference, aloofness, and apoliticism by telling you that individuals do in fact bear responsibility based on them being beneficiaries. So for example, men cannot deny their patriarchal role by simply saying, not all men. They cannot treat themselves as somehow being distant or different from the bad patriarchy of other men. Because you might be the most woke feminist man, but you still benefit from the privilege of being a man. So yes, all men should bear responsibility for patriarchy, and similarly, white British individuals should bear responsibility for colonialism even if they did not cause it, but simply because of the fact that they benefit from the racism and the colonial development it brought. This is the spirit in which we aim to advocate individuals to bear responsibility for their government's actions. Now, two things about this debate. Firstly, the motion is about bearing responsibility in a general sense and does not imply that everyone should bear equal and homogeneous responsibility. So, them as the opposition, they cannot get away by simply mentioning fringe examples of victims, because we already said beneficiaries. Men are beneficiaries for patriarchy, so we are not holding women or marginalized groups accountable for patriarchy. Secondly, this is not a policy debate where we figure out mechanisms of holding individuals responsible. Instead, this is a principled debate. Our job is to simply show you that the benefits of individuals being morally responsible for their government's actions outweigh the harms. So similarly, they cannot get away by simply saying that individuals cannot logistically be held responsible, because that's not what the debate is about. It's about should not. And hence, they will have to show that individuals bearing responsibility is somehow harmful and outweighs the benefits we show. Moving on. What exactly do we mean by responsibility? What kind of responsibility are we talking about? We are not talking about legal responsibility. So we are not here to stereotype, punish, or cancel you based on what your government is doing. Instead, we are advocating for individual moral responsibility, where individuals feel like they owe something to each other and they cannot distance themselves from the government, because indifference from them is exactly what governments use to divide individuals into ascribed identities and prevent shared solidarity. We will show you 3 benefits of creating a world where individuals are responsible for the government. First, it leads to the practice of collective responsibility, where people create a conducive culture for mobilization. Second, it prevents people from hiding behind the veil of helplessness or complicity. Oh, we can't do anything, it's all orders from above. And third, it leads to a stronger and more accountable democracy. Ultimately, governments are a reflection of society, making us collectively responsible. But what is society other than the culmination of our collective actions? Thank you.
The first speaker for the opposition will be Rohan Chopra from India, reading for an MSc in Modern South Asian Studies at St. Edmund Hall.
As of 2022, 71% of the world's population, which is 5.7 billion people, live in autocracies. Of these, 3.5 billion people live in electoral autocracies, and only 2.3 billion people live in liberal democracies. When talking of holding individuals responsible for the actions of their governments, side proposition must deal with the realities of this world and its ramifications. The idea of democracy that has been extensively discussed in these historic chambers and become the norm the world over is that of modern representative democracy. This model entails a distinct, indirect relationship between the representative and the represented, which requires the representative to act independently in decision-making, diverging from voter interests who do not even have a right to recall in a non-violent manner. As a result, responsibility of actions exists with government's members and its state actors, but not the people themselves. They speak of people being from different backgrounds and there being different forms of responsibility. We're not denying that privileged communities being beneficiaries requires a different treatment, but they also forget intersectionality. They forget that the responsibility that a straight white woman would have as opposed to a queer brown man is different. However, this is still a limited normative picture. If we return to the statistics I presented earlier, then it becomes critical to ask who individual, which government. Do we mean the minuscule number of people who are eligible to vote who actually end up voting, or do we mean the majority? The majority of the people in China, in Algeria, in North Korea, in Syria, in Yemen, in Venezuela, or in Afghanistan, none of whom have the right to decide who governs them. While side proposition offers a normative definition that ignores all these realities, we on side opposition argue that by individuals, we mean every single person who will be impacted by holding a people responsible, because any form of holding responsible will invariably be collective, as they themselves admit. Though the actions we speak of here are then those that deliberately cause physical, economic, or psychological harm to a people, in ignoring the indirect relationship of voters with the governments, side proposition deceives you by reducing responsibility and personal preferences to an overdetermined vote. In holding individuals responsible for the acts of their governments, the world of side proposition has failed to protect the people, and instead, in their efforts to hold people responsible, they have treated their bodies and lives as sites of violence, hunger, and death. Though side proposition may limit the scope of what they mean now, it is upon them to deal with the ghost of the travesty and lives that their principled position has destroyed. They are responsible for all the livelihoods that have been decimated with their logic, and their case is incomplete until they prove to us what justifies this cost. In holding the individual responsible, they deliberately emphasize collective responsibility, which harms every individual, and elide the ideologies that drive these actions, as if pinning them onto the overdetermined vote of an individual person is going to solve these systemic issues, like racism or patriarchy. On the other hand, we on side opposition believe in reconciliation. We believe in repairing the harm caused by actors and governments. This means that if a leader wages a war or ethnically cleanses their population, they and their instruments should be held accountable, but this should not be extended to people they govern or be the end point. Instead, this ought to be a way to initiate larger conversations about justice, freedom, and equality. People in the House, when you vote today, imagine the world you want to live in. Is this a world where perpetrators are held responsible for their acts and this is used as a gateway for justice? Or is this a world where each and every person in a state is held responsible for what governments administering them have done? What world would you want to live in? Thank you.
The second speaker for the proposition will be Mikhailo Kirtenko from Ukraine, reading for a Master of Public Policy at Lincoln College.
Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished opposition team, you rightfully mentioned that the world that we live now is unjust. But that's exactly what we're trying to change with our motion. Indeed, personal responsibility standard under the autocracy is lower. But it's never zero. It's never non-existent. You're saying that people cannot be held responsible because it's the government machinery that changes them, that does not allow them to express themselves, that does not allow them to change the system. What you're essentially saying, that they're just cogs in the system. But cogs can block the machine from moving. Even the smallest cog can change how the machine operates. Agency exists on a spectrum. Even individuals in relatively powerless positions can still exercise moral judgment and take actions to resist or mitigate harm. Even small acts of resistance or refusal to participate in wrongdoing can have meaningful consequences. When talking about personal responsibility, as Taha mentioned, on the present level, we also don't have to forget about the past. Let's take a moment to reflect on the weight of history, the injustices, the struggles, the pain. Yes, we cannot change the past, but that doesn't mean we can ignore it. Imagine carrying a heavy burden on your shoulders, one that threatens to crush you. This burden is not of your own making, but it's the one that we must all take ownership of to move forward and not to get crushed under its weight. How we choose to narrate the past isn't just a matter of academic debate. It's the reflection of who we are as a society. Do we sweep uncomfortable truth under the carpet, or do we confront it head-on? Do we allow resentment to fester, or do we strive for reconciliation and healing? We should neither seek guilt for the past in the present, nor try to forget it. Our belief is that acknowledging personal responsibility can pave the way for shared responsibility. As members of society, we all contribute to the production and reproduction of structural injustices. And even more, we benefit from them. The responsibility we stand for is not to assign blame or fault, rather to galvanize political accountability to organize responsible collective action for change. We should not hide behind the excuse of helplessness, because we know that that's not true. Change can only happen if individuals feel responsible and take action. The Danish people's successful effort to protect the Jews during the Holocaust is a prime example of moral responsibility in action. Danish officials, police officers, fishermen, ordinary citizens, they worked together to relocate and transport nearly all the Jews in the country to safety in Sweden. This case marks organized resistance to Nazi genocidal policies and shows whether it's racial segregation, slavery, unjust wars waged in our names, or colonization, these injustices and their aftermaths were not simply matters of government policy, but social ills that each of us can and should resist. These injustices compel us to take ownership of our government's action and strive for a just society, for better society, better than the one that opposition team described. The proposition stands for building bridges, not walls, and finding common ground to unite us in our common sense of responsibility to hold our government accountable and drive positive change. Thank you.
The second speaker for the opposition will be Sogan Betwal from Nepal, reading for an MSc in Comparative Social Policy at Trinity College.
The proposition here today has already tried and will keep trying to get away with being answerable by limiting our understanding of what we mean when we say governments by only talking about democracies, or they'll only talk about responsibilities in terms of moral and avoid being accountable for legal, political, and legal responsibilities. As my team member earlier has already set the case for this, no matter the type of government, no matter the type of responsibility that we're talking about today, no individual who hasn't been a part of the act can ever be held responsible. Let's just talk about democracies that the proposition is trying to really emphasize here today. Even in representative democracies, when people vote, they vote for the people that they want to be represented by while being unaware about the kind of decisions that this government will go and take. So are you suggesting that individuals who have just voted but are unaware about the decisions that the government can take should be held responsible without being aware at all? So now the proposition will keep arguing, like people have the power, individuals can create change, individuals have to go and protest and march and whatnot. Do you think people haven't done that? Even if people do so, governments might not always hear their people. Let's just talk about London. Let's just talk about what happened in London in 2003. When 1.5 million people came down to the streets of London to protest against the invasion that was happening in Iraq, led by the government of United States of America, supported by the government of United Kingdom and others. Did the people not resist? They did. Did the government listen? No. Did the invasion still happen? It did. What's the conclusion? Lies and only lies by these democratic governments. See, it's very clear. Individuals have clearly no influence over government, especially when it comes to foreign policies. Now, throughout the night today, you'll listen to propositions saying, the reality is not that complex. They'll just try to keep simplifying it for us today. But people, we live in a very complex world. Just look around you. Think about the current day Russia, which is a mature, authoritative regime. Think about the people that live in Russia, whose rights have since long, go back to 2014, go back before that, their rights have since long been restricted. Are you saying that these individuals who even a single action can in different ways risk their lives, are you expecting for these individuals to go out and change when their lives is at stake at every second that they live? And, let me just draw our attention back to the motion. We're talking about individuals. We're talking about individuals who are citizens. We're talking about individuals who are refugees, who are displaced, who are children, who are diaspora. The motion accounts for everybody. The proposition today cannot try to get away with being answerable by just limiting it to citizens and those who are within the territory. According to UNHCR, as of 2023, there are 36.5 million refugees worldwide. These individuals who have no right over the government, no influence over the government that they just fled or the government that they are living under, can ever be held accountable. How are you expecting for them to be responsible? Even the principle of non-refoulement guarantees that no one should be returned to the country where they would face torture, cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment or punishment. So for the proposition here to suggest, even in the slightest of sense, that these refugees should be held accountable is very much against the refugee protection that we study about in this university. So when we start holding individuals accountable, you see, we unfairly account for every single individual who will only be further and further marginalized, which my team member will talk about later. So there can be no situation, no scenario, no ifs and buts under which any individual can be considered responsible. When somebody does not hold the power to influence or decide, when somebody is misguided by false information, which the governments today do, look at China. When individuals are fighting for their mere existence in this world, how can you expect for them to be responsible? So there can be no valid reason to put even an ounce of responsibility. That's it. Thank you.
The third speaker for the proposition will be Faizan Ahmed from India, reading for a Bachelor of Civil Law at Mansfield College.
ladies and gentlemen, I come from a country that takes pride in calling itself the world's largest democracy. Yet, all those who question the government, activists, journalists, are jailed, Muslims and Dalits are persecuted on a daily basis, and we are no longer a secular democracy. In such a state, I do not think that upper caste Hindus in India can distance themselves from the BJP and say, #not in my name. We want a world where the silent majority who are beneficiaries realize that such acts are always being done precisely in their names. I shall show you that this kind of individual responsibility leading to the kind of change that they want can only happen on our side of the house. But before that, a few clarifications. Sogun talked about refugees and children and women. Taha already clarified that these are not the people benefiting from the actions of the governments. They are the victims, so they're already outframed of the debate. This is about the majority silent, complicit in the actions of their government. 2. Now let me address the opposition's case so far. Three things that we have majorly heard. First, we heard from Rohan that these are structural issues that cannot be resolved, that structural and systemic change is not done by individuals. Yet, they do not tell you who brings this structural and systemic change. Structural and systemic change does not fall from the heavens. It is achieved by constant mobilizations and struggles by the people themselves. They never tell you who does that, because when they go ahead and would say that, they'll be compelled to accept that that starts from yourself, from people like you and me. Second, they say that, look, people have been protesting all this long, but still countries go to war and bad things happen. We think on a moral principle. The moral responsibility to protest is not dependent on whether you succeed or not, but it is really to tell the people that you're there on the battlefield. And finally, I'll take you at this point. Quickly.
Oh, sorry. How can you expect for people to come and protest on moral grounds when they cannot even step out of their house?
Thank you. I got that point. So that is a question about democracies that don't allow citizens to participate equally. And that is precisely what we are going to address today. 2 points on that. Let us imagine a world where individuals do feel responsible for the actions of their government. We create a sense of ownership, where individuals take ownership and consider themselves as the most important stakeholders in democracy. They can no longer be innocent bystanders who are of relevance only in 5 years when it's time to vote. We actually create conscious, vigilant citizens who are at all times holding their governments accountable, and because they see their government as an extension or a reflection of themselves. 2 consequences flow out of this. First, you create individuals who have an incentive to hold their governments accountable, but more importantly, individuals will ensure that the people that they elect or have the responsibility to take care in forms of any kind of governments are those only who are worthy of being seen as an extension of themselves, and whether they deserve that power or not. Third, when everyone feels responsible in a shared sense that Mikhailo told you about, what you get is the focus is not only on perpetrators, but all those of us as beneficiaries, but on what you as an individual can do to change things. At the dinner table conversations, in your homes, in your offices, in your workspaces, in the streets, and in the classrooms. Now, ultimately, this is about what kind of world do we really want. They want to give you a world where people can twiddle their thumbs and absolve themselves in the complexity of their states by saying they're not responsible. We want a world of shared responsibility that creates solidarity. Sogun talked about the 2003 protests. In the past few months, we have seen unprecedented collective action in London, and particularly in the global north. That was possible only when individuals took responsibility for the actions of their government. When they said that we will not allow weapons to be sent for war, we will not allow governments to contribute to the climate crisis, and not allow them to commit atrocities abroad. For these reasons, vote for the motions. Thank you.
The third speaker for the opposition will be Hanbit Lee from South Korea, reading for an MSc in Energy Systems at Keble College.
Ladies and gentlemen, when do you feel a sense of injustice? Reflect on times that you were blamed for an action that you did not commit. Now, consider individuals who are burdened with responsibilities for their state actions, the association that they did not choose themselves. How can you justify this collective responsibility when it often masks systemic failures and unfairly burdens the most vulnerable in society? Faizan has mentioned the marginalized groups in India. If you're burdening them with collective responsibility, is it fair for us to expect them to hold their own governments accountable when they themselves are not given the power to do so? As we delve into this inquiry of whether it's fair to burden this sort of responsibility onto them, it becomes apparent that the proposition stance overlooks the complex dynamics of government decision-making and unfairly penalizes individuals with limited amount of control. Before advancing our discussion, let us clarify the terms that the proposition has purposefully misconstrued. There is an essential difference between the distribution of responsibility from collectives to their members and holding individuals accountable for their involvement in group action. Arguing from responsibility gaps to individual responsibility is a fallacy. We've established that responsibility should be tied to agents' intentional actions only. International humanitarian law also supports this. Individuals in general do not hold enough power or influence to authorize harm by the state, coerce the state into causing harm, or be complicit in the state's harmful action. Thus, they should not be made to bear responsibilities for the actions of the state. It's simple as that. The real-world repercussions of misapplying collective responsibility are stark and widespread. For instance, UN sanctions in North Korea aimed at curbing nuclear aspirations have inadvertently crippled the nation's food supply, plunging 10 million people, 40% of their nation's population, into severe food insecurity. Similarly, in Syria, Iraq, and Venezuela, sanctions meant to target political leaders have instead inflicted suffering on civilians. Considering the inefficacy and ethical concerns surrounding the collective punishment, we propose an alternative model based on restorative justice. This approach is exemplified in the Convention for Democratic South Africa, which was pivotal in ending apartheid in the 1990s. CODESA steered away from punitive measures and instead prioritized transformative and inclusive political reforms. It acknowledged that peace and stability would stem not from assigning blame for past transgression, but instead looking forward towards comprehensive restructuring of their political and legal framework. So this opposition is not trying to shy away from holding any sort of responsibility, but we're trying to claim that the responsibility lies with society. We should educate our population of the past wrongs, but that responsibility should not fall into individuals. And when we distribute that responsibility, it should be in a proportional manner. And the only fair way of doing so is by assigning it to individuals for the actions that they commit, at which point it is no longer considered collective responsibility. It's them being accountable for their individual actions. I urge the audience to carefully consider the distinction that I just emphasized between collective and individual responsibility and the risks that are involved with overextending the accountability to the general population. Throughout history and still today, the misuse of collective responsibility has led to profound consequences, inflicting lasting wounds in communities, perpetuating injustices, and hindering efforts for systemic change. We must halt the indiscriminate attribution of blame to individuals and instead focus our efforts for systemic change. We should advocate for restorative justice that prioritizes rebuilding and reconciliation. Only then will we be able to live in a world where justice serves as a bridge, not a barrier, towards healing and ultimately moving towards a more equitable and just world. Thank you.
The fourth speaker for the proposition will be Chantel Nicole Nieto, from the Philippines, reading for a Master's in Public Policy at St. Edmund Hall.
To hold people responsible for the actions of their government is to say that everyone has a duty, not only to act morally, but to make sure that those who act in their name do so as well. As Taha and Faizan have already mentioned, the extent by which this moral responsibility can be manifested is in proportion to a person's level of influence, to a particular action, or to where they are in a particular social hierarchy. It'll vary. Some would be via voting in ballots, some would be via protesting in the streets. But the point remains, wherever you are, whoever you are, if you are a part of it, then you are responsible. The point remains that that responsibility has to be there. The point is this, that we all have the duty to discern what for us is right and what is wrong, and to hold what we take part in and what we're part of to that standard. You say that we as individuals have nothing, hardly anything to do with what the government does. And yet, pretty much, what do we legitimize? What do we say yes to? What do we allow to happen? Everything we have influences everything else. The point is, to what standard do we hold ourselves and that into account? Because at the end of the day, we can't keep hiding behind this veil of a government, of institution, saying, cleaning our hands and saying, that's not my problem. What world have we created because of that? A world that permits wars, that allows innocent people to get hurt, that allows corruption to abound, and those who are supposed to serve the public, those who are supposed to hear you, enrich simply themselves. What is that the best we could do? You say that that's the world we live in. Yes, it is. Is that all we can really have and aspire for and work towards? If we're not going to hold ourselves responsible for what we can do, for what we have influence on, for the government, then who's going to hold them accountable? Who's going to hold them responsible? The international community, themselves, they're already committing something wrong. Who's going to hold them accountable if not us? You say individual actions can't make a difference. Well, we beg to differ. First and foremost, when we wrote our scholarship applications last year, nearly a year ago, we all were made to answer one question. How can one person make a difference? And we, all of us, WHT scholars, stood up and said, and cited examples of how we and countless of other peoples actually made a difference in this world. And you tell me, you have the audacity to say no one can make a difference? We create systems. Yes, systems influence us. Governments can control us. But we are the reason. People create these systems. We've created them before. We can rebuild and recreate them again. We could. And because we could, we should. It is, yes, it's practical to relegate decision-making and power to the government, and even blame to the government. But to hold that power into account, to keep them accountable, is what is principled. It might not be what's most practical, but it is what is most principled.
Point of information.
And I know that this is also what each and every one here wants to do, to be, and to have. And holding individuals responsible for the actions of their government is probably also the only way to achieve a world where, as Taha said, we have an environment that is conducive to mobilization, where everyone can probably have a say in what we're doing, where we're not just saying, do that in my name, but do that in accordance or in consultation with where I stand, where we don't hide from the veil of complicity and helplessness, but as Mi has said, we have a shared collective responsibility over each other, a world where, as Faizan beautifully put, we uphold the strength of democratic institutions, maybe not even in democracies, but where leaders are held into account. And when you take that ballot today, I dare you to take into account not just how the world is right now, but how the world could be, how the world should be. Because if we want to create a world that is better led, better served, and better governed, it starts with us.
The fourth speaker for the opposition will be Farid Fakhouri from Syria, reading for Masters of Public Policy and Management.
Ladies and gentlemen, I start to feel that there is some kind of like maybe misunderstanding of the motion, maybe misleading the people here in the House. Being able to say no to what is wrong is not like bearing the responsibility and dealing with the consequences of your government's actions. This is totally and completely two different things. I would like to start with say that assertion of that individuals should bear responsibility for the government's actions dangerously aligns with the kind of rationale used by terrorist organizations. They justify by same rationale killing people, the violence, representing a very fundamentally flawed position. Equating citizens' passive association with their government's actions to active complicity undermines individual moral agency, blurs the ethical distinction between civilians and combatants, and legitimizes a destructive cycle of violence. First, insisting on holding people responsible for their government actions is simply a sick justification for harm to civilians. This approach mirrors a rationale similar to that of terrorists who deem citizens in democracies fair targets due to their electoral or financial support of their governments. After the September 11 terrorist attacks, bin Laden argued that Al-Qaeda was justified in killing all those people in the World Trade Center. Didn't their taxes fund America's CIA assassinations and warplanes, he argued. This rationale demonstrated a disturbing parallel to holding individuals accountable for government actions regardless of their direct involvement or even opposition. Second, international law clearly distinguishes between combatants and non-combatants to minimize harm to civilians in conflicts. The origin of this critical distinction, under cover of collective responsibility, has been observed in the tactics used by the Syrian government forces violating international humanitarian law and international legal norms established in the Geneva Conventions by targeting areas populated by civilians under the pretext they support the opposition. Lastly, holding people responsible can create a feedback loop of hatred and conflict. Measures like reciprocal sanctions, military interventions between Western countries and nations like Iran and North Korea, based on the principle of collective responsibility, not only foster a sense of injustice among the affected populations, but sadly, it encourages hardline viewpoints, fueling conflicts instead of paving the way towards peaceful resolutions. Ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, the opposition advocates for understanding individual responsibility within the broader context of global political system by emphasizing the necessity for ethical governance, human rights protection, and peace promotion. We strongly reject the motion on moral, legal, and practical grounds. Our perspective not only seeks justice at the individual level, but also strive for a more equitable and understanding world. Vote for the opposition to champion a vision of global solidarity, where responsibility is accurately and proportionately placed, and collective action aims to healing, or for healing and prosperity, rather than perpetuating cycles of violence and blame.
One question. All your arguments about international law, we already clarified that this is about moral responsibility and not legal responsibility.
that's your clarification, of course. What I'm talking about here is that the kind of consequences, dealing with consequences of the government, the kind of actions, bad actions happening with this. So governments like Syrian government using this, other governments, of course, violating international law under the same kind of approach, which is collective responsibility. All these people, could be millions, support the other side. They don't exist. They should die. Why? Because they bear collective responsibility. Thank you.
Actually, I think our debaters deserve another round of applause. I love the number of hands that we have, and I haven't even called for questions yet. Thank you to our debaters for thought-provoking, really engaging and insightful, really thoughtful contributions to tonight's debate. We're going to move into questions in a question and answer session now. We will be going through questions online as well as questions in the room. This side of the room caught my eye first. I don't know how we're going to take 4 questions max, so I'm not sure how we're going to. Okay, so we'll start with you. Thank you.
Thank you. My question goes to the proposition. So if individuals should bear responsibility, are you saying individuals in Afghanistan should bear responsibility of the actions of the government? Individuals in the United States should bear responsibility for the actions of the United States supporting the war in Israel. My question is, what does responsibility mean?
Thank you for that question. As far as responsibility is concerned, we clarified that we are targeting the majority significant beneficiaries of such governments. So questions like victims of war in Afghanistan are not really benefiting from the actions of the Afghanistan government. In the same case, the responsibility for US imperialism is not on those who are the victims of such imperialism, but those people who participate and are complicit in the US government by being silent and not actively disowning themselves from that government. And that is why individual responsibility is important to hold and dissociate yourselves by resisting such governments.
Just 30 seconds to add, if you wanted to add.
We also believe that it is important to distinguish between those who are to be blamed for the act and so should receive punishment because of doing the act, and those who are complicit or are part of the act within this whole intercomplexity of decision-making in society, and so should be responsible or should have responsibility to mitigate harms, to change systems, and pretty much to, as Faizan said, resist. So there's a difference between accountability, punishment, and what we call moral responsibility or the duty to pretty much act on what we have influence on based on our agency and based on our capacities.
Thank you.
Thank you. This is for both sides. So just flipping the logic of the question a bit on its head, when you talk about responsibility and individuals own a relationship to that, should they also be held morally praiseworthy for good things their government does? In the case of, and as an American, my tax dollars, do they make me any way responsible for the development of the COVID-19 vaccine or things of that nature?
Anyone want to take on either side?
You go first.
Yeah, we just spoke.
Thank you for the question. I think, as we've argued, that the responsibility should lie proportionally. The benefits that we gain as a society should also lie proportionally. So however much tax that you paid that contributed to that R&D and that contributed to the innovation that we're all benefiting from, that's your contribution to society. And that's just economic terms, but I'm not, the opposition is not just reducing down to economic means, but by social participation and other ways of participating in the society. But it's your individual action and the amount of contribution that you made to the society, and that equates to how much portion of the benefits that you've contributed to. Thank you for that question.
The spirit of the question was, what happens when government end up doing good things? Should that be attributed to the individuals? We think that is precisely what we want, because we should not let governments take away the credits of popular movements, of the achievements done by people's struggles and resistances. And it is for these reasons we don't want the credit of the individuals and their movements to be snatched away by the government for their propaganda. And therefore, the achievements and the good things of the government are not by some abstract entity, but a victory for the people themselves. Thank you.
I'm wondering whether to switch back to the online question. I'll take one more and then I'll switch to online questions. Yes, please.
Thank you for this great debate. So I have a question for the opposition. If individuals cannot bear responsibility for the actions of the government, how do we make sense of citizens of states which are founded on injustice? So for example, Israel was founded on the Nakba of Palestinians, and people from the US and Europe, white people in San Francisco and LA, were given keys to Palestinian homes to move to Israel. Now, given the history of what the citizens of Israel mean for the government, how do we understand their role in the genocide of Palestinians that the Israeli government is doing, of course, with the help of US and UK right now? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. For us, when we speak of the question of Israel, it becomes important also to think of what happens in another context like colonialism, which is the Americas, or in the context of South Africa, where we spoke about we spoke about the Truth and Reconciliation Committee, which requires where blame is not pinned just on individuals, but on systems, on a political project. So in the case of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the blame is pinned on the system of racism, on the system of apartheid, and we want to topple that down. Right? So in the case of Israel, with this, we come across the same sort of issue, wherein is something like Nuremberg trials enough? Or do we need something more? Do we need something which is more systemic, which speaks to systemic issues? Or do we just need something which speaks to, individual, bad, you did something, bad? We want that kind of systemic change that you asked about. Thank you.
We have one here from the online audience. It says, to the opposition, if the people in Russia elected their government, is it not logical to assume that they are responsible for the policy of their government or to change it? Should I repeat that? It says, if the people in Russia elected their government, is it not logical to assume that they are responsible for the policies of their governments or to change it?
Thank you very much for that question. Russia in paper still might be a democratic country, but in practice it's very much an authoritative regime. So people, first of all, even in democracies that this proposition has really cited today, not everybody votes. Not everybody votes for this exact government. There's no right to recall. People do not hold the power to recall their government. They have to wait for the elections. That happens after 5 years. Talk about direct democracies, that not feasible. So many problems with democracies that they're talking about. And even in these countries, government don't tell you, I'm going to be an authoritative regime from now on. Do governments come and consult with people? Not at all. So it's not up to the people yet again when it comes to governments who hold sovereignty to make decisions. They're not consulting with people on how they should function. They do it on their own. They exercise their autonomous power. So same in the case of Russia. People didn't have the say. People are not responsible.
Yes.
Very briefly, let's also remember that in the case of democracies, there's a question of the choice. And we know of countries like Russia and even China for that matter, and many other countries where choice really just goes away. And let's not forget what happened just about, a week or two ago with whatever happened to Navalny, right? This is something wherein choice is being taken away over and over and over again from the people. Thank you.
Thank you. questions? Do you still have your question? I know you raised your hand earlier.
Thank you, both sides, for an amazing debate. I think I have a question for the proposition. One of your speakers mentioned repeatedly moral responsibility for protests, and that moral responsibility of a protest does not depend on whether or not the protest is successful. I guess my question is, if you know for a fact that your protest does not create any change, will not be successful whatsoever, does not make a significant difference for the policy that you're concerned, and the risk of protests could get you detained, deported, or killed, what is the point of debate over so-called moral responsibility? And are we students of an elite college taking a very privileged position to instill moral judgment and responsibility in individuals who are taking actual risks on the ground that we're not adjacent to? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. The obligation to protest, like I said, does not depend on whether you succeed or not. Now, even if you know that you are not going to succeed, the objective to mobilize, to protest, is not always to ensure change, but to bring people together. And we think when people come together for collective action, that is itself something that needs to be valued. When people struggle together, they realize their common things that they can do together and the kind of impact that they can have. We have seen this, how in the past few months, something that was one-sided and a complete asymmetrical power relationship and a narrative that we thought can never be overturned is gradually being overturned by the power of people and social media. What would have happened if they all thought that it is of no use and we're never going to be making any difference to the world? If each one of us starts thinking that we're never going to make any difference, I don't think we would have any change in this world. Thank you.
And if I may just add, it's not that we're taking a privileged position whatsoever. Thank you for that. But it's also just not about us. I work a lot with marginalized communities, so I can understand when I say, or when we say, that it's very hard to think long term, or even just about the next day, about education, all of these things, what's abstract when you have to have your family to feed. But at the end of the day, as we said over and over again, it depends on your sphere of influence, on what you can do. What we're asking isn't that you give your whole life up, it's that you do what you can. Because it's your moral responsibility to at least discern what is right from wrong, to at least equate that standard to how you act on a day-to-day basis. And at the end of the day, understand, once again, that it's not just about you, it's not just about me, it's about this whole world and society. And if we keep living just for ourselves, then what kind of world would we even have? Something like that.
We'll take one more question.
Hi, my question is for the proposition. So the proposition has spoken about this silent majority profiting off of the status quo, off of the oppressive actions of their governments, and seemingly asserts that these are the individuals in particular that need to be held responsible. But from my understanding, isn't this just a selective reframing of the question? The question isn't about certain individuals in certain nations under moral obligations. It's about all people being responsible for the actions of their government. So if you limit the scope of any question, you can tailor any argument to the subset of that question. Like, what is your response to all people being responsible to the actions of their government?
It's me again. Thank you for that. No. To answer your specific question in terms of whether it should be or how should we phrase it if it's about all people, once again, we're talking about the beneficiaries. So the silent majority is the majority. It pretty much sums up nearly all people, except for those, say, who are incapacitated, who literally can't, who, based on Kant's moral principle, for instance, cannot be held morally responsible for what they do. So there's that exception. But at the same time, we also constantly talk about proportionality. So once again, the extent by which you are involved in the action, in the results of the action or so on, will then pretty much or ought to be proportional to how responsible you are. So yes, the silent majority who benefit a lot would have more responsibility. Let's say, okay, the decision makers and the leaders would have most. And then the silent majority, the beneficiaries, would have a proportional amount to it based on the benefits that derive from it and the influence they have. And then all else would once again still be within that equation of proportionality. How much are they a part of it? Does that then exclude them from the equation, or is it nearly a significant amount? Almost there.
We'll take one more.
Just to add to feel a big shoes to fill, but we also believe that sometimes to bring about the change, you don't have to do something great. It starts with small action. It starts with understanding that you feel different, that you not agree with something, you not agree with your government, and it all starts from small. We also believe that in many instances, not everyone have to be responsible, which is true, and that agency exists in a very small spectrum, but in a very large proportion of people. And everyone has their say. It doesn't matter whether you are small or big, whether you have big word to say, or whether you have ability to impact the great change just today, or maybe you can do something to bring about the change in a few years.
And so that brings us to the end of the question and answers and a fantastic debate. One more time, round of applause for our debaters. So we're going to do the end vote now. I think you all have the QR codes either at the end of your seats, or you can go to menti.com, and I'll read out the code, menti.com, MENTI.com. And the code is 8141 0822 8141 0822. No, debaters cannot vote, please. While we're doing that, there's a QR code that's going around, or menti.com 8141 0822. 8141 0822.
Jordan. I can't speak now because I'll get it in. Okay, everyone, while you're all voting, I just want to say a few words. First of all, thank you all very much for coming. This is a really important event for us, And we are very pleased that you've come to support our scholars, because this is one of the important parts of our leadership program. And I think it's always amazing, because for many it's the first time they've debated. For others, as you can tell, it's a mixture, definitely. And obviously we had a very important bell ringer tonight, definitely. We have wonderful people who train our scholars every year, but it is always a huge pleasure and very, very good to be filling this room from people from so many parts of the world. And it is always a wonderful sight to see you all, and it's something, a tradition we really want to keep up. I want to thank Rhett very much, because he's really trying to do 10 million other things, but we persuaded him to join us tonight, and that's very, very good. But I do also want to say that all our scholars, you've only seen a few of them tonight, but actually everyone's been helping in all sorts of ways. And Jordan, who was finding it all big strain, has been fantastic. So I don't know whether yet we've managed to get to the finding the sums, but anyway, as I say, thank you, and please keep coming every year. Look out for this debate. It's always very, very special. Anyway, I hope the maths are there.
I know that Alexandra called them out, but I just want to especially recognize Dennis and Lisha, our trainers. They are mentors. They took out time to train us and mentor us through this process. Those are the results. And also Marina, who's managing our online community, Mariana, our floor manager, Sarah, our board counter, and Hel, our timekeeper. Over to you, Ed.
May I say again how grateful I am for all of your participation, for your attendance here, and if I could ask for your indulgence one more time to thank our outstanding debaters this evening. Now, this gratitude is one that's being offered collectively. May I offer my gratitude individually. As a father, my family is here with me tonight, and this has been a wonderful example to them of spirited, well-researched, and civil debate, which I think is a wonderful thing for our children to be able to see. So thank you very much to each one of the debaters. I will say that as a very proud and very grateful alumnus of the WHT program, it gives me a lot of joy to see that this program continues to attract and to promote and to serve such outstanding scholars as I've had the opportunity to meet and interact with, and how wonderful it is to be a part of this broader community. This evening has been an opportunity for me, I hope for everyone, to ponder what is your government doing, the government that seeks to speak in your name? And is there something that is bothering your conscience? And as you think about that, is there something that you can do? What do you owe to our collective human family? And what do you owe to your conscience that you could make the world a better place? Going back to that first question that I brought in, what do we owe each other? I have devoted my profession to the promotion of water security. And may I suggest that when we think about what we are collectively, each one of us is a drop in a mighty river. And when we think about what we owe to each other, may I suggest that the answer comes from the great philosopher and martial artist Bruce Lee, who said, "Be water, my friends." Two attributes of water that I would suggest that we owe to each other. One is, I come from the desert and water beautifies everything that it touches. It brings to life everything around it. The other thing the water does is water is persistent. Sometimes water is barely crawling through the riverbed, it's invisible. Sometimes it's overspilling its banks and harming even those that it depends on and promotes and serves. But give water a long enough time and it will carve the Grand Canyon. So may I suggest that what we owe one another is persistence in our pursuit of a better world. And as I end, may I say, again, thanks to our debaters, the vote is 111 total votes. The ayes have 63, the nays 48, and the winner is the proposition. Thank you.
Close. Thank you all for coming, and I guess we'll spend the rest of the evening chatting and having a nice evening. Thank you.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. It's so much fun. Oh, it was great. I love it.